Peaceful residents were killed, and industrial enterprises and cultural institutions were destroyed. On the morning of August 24th, elements of the enemy's 14th Tank Corps launched an attack on the Stalingrad tractor plant in the northern part of the city, but they were unsuccessful. Armed workers from Stalingrad's factories joined the battle. Simultaneously, Soviet troops of the Stalingrad front, who had been pushed back northeastward, attacked the enemy's Volga River wedge from the north. This forced the enemy to divert substantial forces intended for the seizure of Stalingrad, weakening their strike against the city. The 14th Tank Corps was cut off from its support units for several days and had to be resupplied by air. However, after crossing the Don River, the enemy developed a more aggressive offensive against the city, supported by heavy airstrikes. By August 30th, under intense pressure, the troops of the southeast front had been forced back first to the outer defence ring and then to the inner defence ring. The 62nd and 64th Armies were attempting to hold a line on the western outskirts of Stalingrad, running through Rynok, Orlovka, Gumrak, Peshchanka, and Ivanovka. The 62nd Army was commanded by Lieutenant General A.I. Lopatin. Despite the enemy's superior forces, Lopatin chose to preserve the 62nd Army for a stand within the city, where the enemy would ultimately be depleted and destroyed. During these critical days, Supreme Headquarters ordered diversionary offensive operations west of Moscow to tie down enemy reserves and prevent them from being shifted to Stalingrad. On the Western Front, where I was in command at the time, events unfolded as follows. Left wing. The 16th and 61st Armies attacked on July 10th in the Kirov-Bolkov sector toward Bryansk. Right wing. At Pogorelye-Gorodishche, the reinforced 20th Army, in coordination with the left wing of the Kalinin Front, launched a successful offensive in August, aimed at defeating the enemy in the Saikevka-Rozhev area. The offensive was halted after breaking through the German defences and reaching the Rozhev-Vyazma railroad, but Rozhev itself remained in enemy hands. The Germans suffered heavy losses, and to halt our advance they were forced to commit divisions that had originally been intended for Stalingrad and the Caucasus. German General Kurt Tippelskirch later commented, "A breakthrough was prevented when 3 tank divisions and several infantry divisions that were already getting ready to move to the southern front were held back and thrown into the battle to first localize the breakthrough and then to counterattack. Had we had 1 or 2 more armies at our disposal, we could have defeated the enemy in the entire Rozhev-Vyazma salient and improved our operational situation on the Western Front, but our forces were stretched thin at the time." On August 27th, as I was overseeing the offensive in the area of Pogorelye-Gorodishche, I received a call from An Poskrebyshev, Stalin's chief of staff. He informed me that, in light of the situation in the south, the State Defense Committee had appointed me Deputy Supreme Commander-in-Chief. I was instructed to be at my command centre at 2 p.m. and await a call from Stalin. Poskrebyshev was vague, offering little information beyond this. It was clear, however, that the State Defense Committee was deeply concerned about the developments around Stalingrad. Soon, Stalin called. After inquiring about the situation on the Western Front, he said, "You better come to Supreme Headquarters as soon as you can. Put the Chief of Staff in charge." He then added, "Give some thought to who should be appointed commander in your place." That was the extent of our conversation. Stalin did not mention my new role as Deputy Supreme Commander. He typically kept telephone conversations brief and to the point. I travelled to Moscow that evening and arrived at the Kremlin late at night. Stalin was working in his office, and several members of the State Defense Committee were present. Poskrebyshev announced my arrival, and I was immediately admitted. Stalin stated that the situation in the south was dire, with the Germans poised to capture Stalingrad. He also mentioned the worsening situation in the northern Caucasus. The State Defense Committee had decided to appoint me Deputy Supreme Commander and send me to Stalingrad. Vasilevsky, Malenkov and Malishev were already there. Malenkov was to stay in Moscow with me, and Vasilevsky would return to Moscow. Stalin asked how soon I could depart. I told him I needed a day to assess the situation and would fly to Stalingrad on the 29th. Stalin then asked, Aren't you hungry? It wouldn't hurt to have a little refreshment. Over tea, Stalin briefed me on the situation as of 8 p.m. on August 27th. He explained that German forces had crossed the Don in force, and he had decided to transfer several key armies to the Stalingrad front. The 24th Army, commanded by General Kozlov. The 1st Guards Army, commanded by Major General K.S. Moskalenko. The 66th Army, commanded by Malinovsky. The 1st Guards Army was to be moved north of Stalingrad and attack the German Volga River wedge on September 2nd in an attempt to link up with the 62nd Army. Stalin emphasized, "Under the cover of Moskalenko's army, you must then promptly move the 24th and 66th Armies into battle. Otherwise, we may lose Stalingrad." Stalin was adamant that the battle for Stalingrad was of the utmost military and political importance. If the city fell, the Germans would be able to cut off the south of the Soviet Union from the rest of the country. The Volga River, a crucial transportation artery, would be lost, along with the vital flow of goods from the Caucasus. I left for Stalingrad on August 29th, arriving near Kamyshin on the Volga, north of the city. I met with Vasilevsky, who briefed me on the latest developments. We then drove to the Stalingrad front headquarters at Malaya Ivanovka. There we met with General Gordov, Chief of Staff Nikishev, and Operations Chief Ruchel, who reported that the situation was unclear, and they were unsure whether the enemy could be stopped at Stalingrad. After speaking with General Gordov and Major General Moskalenko, I felt more confident. They were familiar with the enemy's strength and their own forces' capabilities. We decided that the combined forces of the three armies would not be ready for a counterattack before September 6th. I immediately informed Stalin of our decision, and he expressed no objections. The 1st Guards Army was unable to begin its offensive on September 2nd due to delays in fuel and troop movements. At General Moskalenko's request, I postponed the attack to September 3rd. However, the offensive was less successful than anticipated. Enemy airstrikes and counterattacks by tanks and infantry stalled our advance, and we made little progress. On September 3rd, I received a telegram from Stalin stating, "The situation at Stalingrad has deteriorated further. The enemy stands 2 miles from the city. Stalingrad may fall today or tomorrow if the northern group of forces does not give immediate assistance. See to it that the commanders of forces north and northwest of Stalingrad strike the enemy at once and come to the aid of the Stalingraders. No delay can be tolerated. To delay now is tantamount to a crime. Throw all your air power to the aid of Stalingrad. The city has few planes." I immediately contacted Stalin, explaining that the troops were not yet fully prepared and that our artillery support would not be in position until evening. Stalin was not convinced, demanding action regardless of our readiness. He emphasized the importance of preventing the Germans from taking Stalingrad and ordered an immediate aerial bombardment. The offensive began on September 5th, but artillery fire was insufficient, and enemy resistance, supported by tanks and infantry, forced us back. Despite setbacks, we continued to press the attack. The following day, Stalin called again and urged us to keep up the pressure, even if we had not made significant gains. On September 10th, I assessed the situation and concluded that we would not be able to break through the German lines with the available forces. I reported to Stalin that reinforcements and time to regroup were necessary for a more concentrated frontal assault. Stalin agreed and suggested that I travel to Moscow for a personal report. I flew to Moscow on September 12th, where Vasilevsky also reported on the movements of new German forces. Stalin listened closely and then summed up, "They want to get at the oil of Grozny at any price. Well, now let's see what Zhukov has to say about Stalingrad." I repeated what I had told him by telephone, adding that the 24th, 1st Guards and 66th Armies, which had taken part in the battle of September 5th to 11, were basically good fighting units. Their main weakness was the absence of reinforcements and the shortage of howitzers and tanks needed for infantry support. The terrain on the Stalingrad front was extremely unfavourable to us. It was open terrain dissected by deep gullies that provided excellent cover for the enemy. Having occupied a number of commanding heights, the Germans could now maneuver their artillery fire in all directions. In addition, they could also direct long-range artillery at our forces from the area of Kuzmichi, Akatovka, and the experimental State Farm. Under those conditions, I concluded, the 24th, 1st Guards, and 66th Armies of the Stalingrad front were unable to break through the enemy defences. What would the Stalingrad front need to eliminate the enemy corridor and link up with the Southeast Front? Stalin asked. At least one full-strength field army, a tank corps, 3 tank brigades, and 400 howitzers. In addition, the support of at least one air army during the time of the operation. Vasilevsky expressed agreement with my estimate. Stalin reached for his map showing the disposition of Supreme Headquarters reserves and studied it for a long time. Vasilevsky and I stepped away from the table and, in a low voice, talked about the need for finding another way out. "What other way out?" Stalin suddenly interjected, looking up from the map. I had never realized he had such good hearing. We stepped back to the map table. "Look," he continued, "you better get back to the General Staff and give some thought to what can be done at Stalingrad, and how many reserves, and from where we will need to reinforce the Stalingrad group. And don't forget about the Caucasus front. We will meet again tomorrow evening at 9. Vasilevsky and I spent the entire following day studying possible alternatives. We concentrated on the possibility of a single major operation which would avoid using up our reserves in a large number of isolated operations. By October, we were to have completed the formation of strategic reserves that would include well-equipped new tank forces. By that time, Soviet industry would also have increased the production of newly designed planes and of ammunition for our artillery. After discussing the various alternatives, Vasilevsky and I decided to submit the following plan to Stalin. First, to continue to wear down the enemy by an active defence. Second, to prepare a counter-offensive of such magnitude against the enemy at Stalingrad as to shift the strategic situation in the south decidedly in our favour. As for a detailed plan for such a counter-offensive, we were, of course, unable in one day to prepare all the necessary calculations, but it seemed clear to us that the main thrusts would have to be directed against the Romanian-held flanks of the Stalingrad grouping. Rough estimates showed that such a counter-offensive could not be prepared before the middle of November. Our assessment was based on the assumption that the Germans were in no condition to fulfill their strategic plans for 1942, and that the forces at their disposal in the autumn of 1942 would not suffice to achieve their objectives, either in the northern Caucasus or on the Don and the Volga. All the forces that the German command could send into the Caucasus and towards Stalingrad had been greatly worn down and weakened. The enemy was evidently incapable of moving additional troops into the south, and would ultimately have to go over to the defensive on all sectors, just as had happened after the battle for Moscow. We knew that Paulus's 6th Field Army and Hoth's 4th Tank Army, two of the Wehrmacht's most effective striking forces, had been so weakened in the gruelling fighting for Stalingrad that they would be unable to complete the capture of the city. As for the Soviet troops, they had suffered such heavy casualties in the fierce fighting on the approaches to Stalingrad, and were to suffer more within the city itself, that they were unable to defeat the enemy with existing forces. The large strategic reserves equipped with new arms were not yet ready, but by November, Supreme Headquarters would have at its disposal strong new mechanized and tank forces equipped with the world-famous T-34 tanks, which would enable us to undertake more far-reaching tasks. In addition, our senior commanders had learned a great deal in the first period of the war, and, through hard experience with a strong enemy, had become masters of the military art. Commanders, political commissars, and ordinary fighting men of the Red Army had also learned through bitter experience how to meet the enemy in any situation. On the basis of frontline reports, the General Staff had studied the strong and weak sides of the German, Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian troops. The satellite forces were found to be less well-armed, less experienced, and less capable, even in defence, than the German units. And, most important, their soldiers and even many of their officers had no desire to die for others on the distant fields of Russia, where they had been sent by Hitler, Mussolini, Antonescu, Horthy, and the other fascist leaders. The situation of the enemy was further complicated by the fact that he had few troops in his operational reserve in the Volga-Don sector. They amounted to no more than 6 divisions and were scattered over a broad front. We were also favoured by the operational configuration of the front. Soviet forces held enveloping positions with respect to the enemy and might relatively easily improve their bridgeheads south of the Don River at Serafimovich and Kletskaya. In the evening of September 13th, Vasilevsky called Stalin and said we were ready to report. Stalin said he would be busy until 10 o'clock and that we should come at that time. We were in his office at the appointed hour. He greeted us by shaking hands, which he seldom did, and said with an air of annoyance, "Tens and hundreds of thousands of Soviet people are giving their lives in the fight against fascism, and Churchill is haggling over 20 hurricanes. And those hurricanes aren't even that good. Our pilots don't like them." Then, in a quiet tone without any transition, he continued, "Well, what did you come up with? Who's making the report?" "Either of us," Vasilevsky said. "We are of the same opinion." Stalin stepped up to our map. "What have you got here?" he asked. "These are our preliminary notes for a counter-offensive at Stalingrad," Vasilevsky replied. "What are these troops at Serafimovich?" "That would be a new front. We will have to set it up to launch a powerful thrust into the rear of the German forces at Stalingrad. We don't have the forces now for such a big operation." I said that according to our calculations, we would have the necessary forces and could thoroughly prepare the operation in 45 days. "Wouldn't it be better to limit ourselves to a thrust from north to south and from south to north along the Don?" Stalin said. I explained that the Germans would then be able to shift their armoured forces from Stalingrad and parry our thrusts. An attack west of the Don, on the other hand, would prevent the enemy from quickly manoeuvring his forces and bringing up his reserves because of the river obstacle. "Aren't you out too far with your striking forces?" Stalin said. Vasilevsky and I explained that the operation would proceed in 2 stages. After a breakthrough of the German defences, the enemy's forces at Stalingrad would be surrounded, and a strong outer front would be created, isolating his forces from the outside. Then we would proceed to destroy the trapped Germans and stop any attempts to come to their aid. "We will have to think about this some more and see what our resources are," Stalin said. "Our main task now is to hold Stalingrad and to keep the enemy from advancing toward Kamyshin." At that point, Poskrebyshev walked in and said Yeremenko was on the phone. After his talk with Yeremenko, Stalin said, "Yeremenko says the enemy is bringing up tank forces near the city. He expects an attack tomorrow." Turning to Vasilevsky, Stalin added, "Issue orders immediately to have Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Division cross the Volga and see what else you can send across the river tomorrow." Then Stalin told me, "Call Gordov and Golovanov and tell them to start air attacks immediately. Gordov will have to attack first thing in the morning to tie down the enemy. You better get back to the Stalingrad front and size up the situation around Kletskaya and Serafimovich. In a few days, Vasilevsky will have to visit the southeast front and study the situation on its left wing. We will talk about our plan later. No one, beyond the 3 of us, is to know about it for the time being." I boarded my plane an hour later and flew back to the headquarters of the Stalingrad front. "It was my fault," I replied, firmly shaking his hand. "In the intervening years, I unfortunately have forgotten the pilot's name, though I think it was Belyayev, a wonderful man and a highly experienced pilot. I must have flown a total of 130 hours with Comrade Belyayev. He was later killed in an air accident, I am sorry to say. In October, Supreme Headquarters ordered 6 reconstituted divisions across the Volga into Stalingrad to reinforce the 62nd Army, of which little remained beyond headquarters and support units. The Don front was also reinforced to some extent with manpower and equipment. Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff gave particular attention to the formation of the newly constituted Southwest Front. Heavy fighting continued throughout October in Stalingrad itself and in adjoining areas. Hitler issued orders to the command of Army Group B and to Paulus, the 6th Army commander, to seize Stalingrad in the immediate future. For its decisive thrust, the German command shifted forces from the flanks and replaced them with Romanian troops, greatly weakening its defensive positions near Serafimovich and south of Stalingrad. In the middle of October, the enemy launched one more offensive in the hope of finishing off Stalingrad once and for all. But again, the Soviet forces stood fast. The units that distinguished themselves particularly were A.I. Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Division, V.A. Gorishny's 95th Division, V.D. Zholudev's 37th Division, Y.A. Yermolkin's 112th Division, S.F. Gorokov's Group, Tun Lyudnikov's 138th Division, and D.N. Belly's 84th Tank Brigade. The battle raged without stopping for several days and nights, in the streets of the city, in buildings, in factories, on the Volga riverbank, everywhere. But our forces, though suffering heavy casualties, held on to a few small islands in the city. To provide some relief for Stalingrad, troops of the Don Front began an offensive on October 19th. The Germans were again compelled to divert a substantial amount of air power, artillery and tanks from the battle for the city to deal with the new offensive. At the same time, the 64th Army made a counter-attack against the enemy flank in the sector of Kuporosnoye and Zelenaya Polyana, just south of the centre of Stalingrad. Both the Don Front offensive and the counter-attack by the 64th Army eased the situation of the 62nd Army in the city and frustrated the enemy's plans. Without this relief, the 62nd Army might not have been able to hold on to the city, and the Germans might possibly have taken it. At the beginning of November, the Germans tried several times to eliminate a number of nests of resistance in the city. On November 11th, when our forces were completing the vast preparations for their counter-offensive, the enemy attempted one more attack, again without result. By that time, the Germans were at the end of their strength. Prisoner interrogations revealed that the enemy's forces had been greatly reduced, that the morale and political conviction of both soldiers and officers were low, and that few expected to emerge alive from the inferno of Stalingrad. During the entire period of June through November, the enemy had lost 600,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 2,000 guns and mortars, and 1,400 planes in the region of the Don, the Volga, and at Stalingrad. The operational situation of German forces on the Volga had deteriorated. Divisional and corps reserves had been used up, and the flanks of Army Group B were held by unreliable Romanian, Italian and Hungarian troops that were beginning to understand their hopeless situation. The Soviet forces on the Don River were in a favourable position for a counter-offensive by the southwest and Don fronts. South of Stalingrad, the 51st Army, in a local counter-attack, had expelled the enemy from the lake defiles and was in complete control of the favourable defence line along Lakes Sapa, Tsatsa and Barmantsak. On Vasilevsky's recommendation, this line had been selected as the jumping-off point for the November counter-offensive by the left wing of the Stalingrad front. The fierce battle for Stalingrad was in its 4th month. The entire world followed developments with bated breath. The success of the Soviet forces and their courageous struggle against the enemy inspired all mankind and instilled confidence in ultimate victory over fascism. The Battle of Stalingrad was also a tremendous education for victory for our troops. Unit headquarters and staffs received practice in coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery and air power. Our troops learned how to put up stubborn resistance in city streets, combining it with manoeuvres on the enemy's flanks. The morale of our forces rose substantially. All this provided favourable conditions for our counter-offensive. The defensive fighting around Stalingrad and in the northern Caucasus in mid-November of 1942 marked the end of the first period of the Great Patriotic War, which played such a special role in the life of the Soviet people. This was an extremely difficult period for the nation and its armed forces, for the German troops, sowing death and destruction, had driven to the very outskirts of Leningrad and Moscow and occupied most of the Ukraine. By November 1942, enemy troops occupied a huge part of the Soviet Union, an area of 700,000 square miles, and a pre-war population of 80 million. Millions of Soviet people who had been caught by the war were compelled to abandon their cities, villages, factories and plants and move eastward to avoid enemy occupation. Soviet troops were forced by the military situation to retreat into the interior, suffering substantial losses in manpower and materiel. But even during that difficult period, neither the Soviet nation nor its armed forces lost faith in the prospect of the ultimate defeat of the enemy hordes. The mortal danger helped to rally our people even more closely around the Communist Party, and despite every hardship, the enemy was finally stopped in all sectors. The first period of the war provided a serious education in armed struggle with a strong and experienced enemy. The Soviet Supreme Command, the General Staff, and the unit commanders and staffs received invaluable experience in organizing and conducting defensive battles and counteroffensives. The mass heroism of Soviet soldiers and the courage of their commanders, reared by our party, were demonstrated with particular force during the fierce fighting of that period. A positive role was played by the personal example of party members and young communists who, when necessary, sacrificed themselves for the sake of victory. Bright pages in the Chronicle were also contributed by the heroic resistance of the frontier fortress of Brest and of Leningrad, Moscow, Odessa, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, Liepaja, Kiev, and the Caucasus. The first period of the war also saw the emergence of the Soviet Guards. The honorary title of Guards, for mass heroism and valor, was given to 4 cavalry corps, 36 rifle divisions, 27 tank brigades, 32 air regiments, and other units. In the Navy, the Guards title was awarded to 2 cruisers, 4 submarines, 1 destroyer, and 1 minesweeper. Among the first units to receive the title were the 1st Moscow Motorized Rifle Division of Colonel A.I. Zhukov, the 2nd Cavalry Corps of General P.A. Belov, the 3rd Cavalry Corps of General L.M. Dovator, the 4th Tank Brigade of General M. Yer Katukov, the 26th Fighter Plane Regiment of Major A.P. Yudakov, the 31st Dive Bomber Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel F.I. Dobish, the 215th Assault Air Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel L.D. Reyno, the 440th Artillery Regiment of Major A.I. Brukhanov, and the 289th Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment of Major M.K. Yeremenko. The tense armed struggle against the German forces required great expenditure of arms, munitions, and supplies. But despite the loss of key economic regions, factories, and plants, the Soviet people strove with self-sacrificing labor to provide the armed forces with the equipment of war. By the end of the first phase of the war, the country had been converted into a military camp. The Soviet people considered it their duty to do everything in their power for victory over the enemy. Heroic work was also accomplished by members of the Red Army's support services. As many as 6.4 million carloads of military supplies moved over the railroads in the first year and a half of the war. The Army was provided with 113,000 carloads of munitions, 60,000 carloads of arms and equipment, and 210,400 carloads of fuel and lubricants. In 1942, truck transport units alone carried 2.7 million men, 12.3 million tons of supplies, 1,923 tanks, and 3,674 guns. Transport planes carried 532,000 men, including 158,000 wounded. The reorganization of the support services undertaken at the beginning of the war was a complete success. The new organizational structure and skillful selection of commanders, political commissars, and party unit leaders ensured proper use of the tremendous resources that were being made available to the armed forces. And what were the capabilities of the enemy whom the Soviet forces confronted during this first period? That question demands an answer. If only to make clear to our young generation the gravity of the struggle waged by the Soviet people in defense of their homeland. Some of the memoirs and works of fiction do not always show the preparation, experience, and strength of the enemy with whom Soviet soldiers had to deal. First of all, let us consider the basic mass of German troops, soldiers, and officers. The German forces invaded the Soviet Union intoxicated by their easy victories over the armies of Western Europe. They were poisoned with Goebbels' propaganda and firmly convinced both of the possibility of an easy victory over the Red Army and of their own superiority over all other nations. The younger soldiers and officers of the armoured forces and air units were in a particularly arrogant mood. I had occasion to interrogate prisoners in the first few months of the war, and I must say they really believed in Hitler's adventurist promises. Their fighting capacity, special training, and military indoctrination were without question on a high level, particularly in armoured units and the Air Force. The German soldier knew his business in battle and in service in the field. He was steadfast, self-assured, and disciplined. In short, the Soviet soldier faced an experienced, strong enemy who was not to be easily defeated. German headquarters forces and smaller military units were trained in all the techniques of modern warfare. Communications with fighting units in battle were assured mainly by radio, for which equipment was available in abundance at all command levels. Ground forces did their utmost to fulfill their assignments, benefiting from skillful air support that would often clear the way for them. In this initial period of the war, I also had a rather high opinion of the upper German command levels. It was obvious that they had carefully planned and organized their initial thrusts in all strategic sectors. They had picked experienced commanders for armies and other major units, and had correctly evaluated the direction, manpower, and troop composition needed for strikes against weak sectors in our defense lines. Despite all this, the military and political strategy of German fascism turned out to be deeply erroneous and short-sighted. Gross miscalculations and mistakes were made in political and strategic estimates. The forces at Germany's disposal, even including satellite reserves, were clearly inadequate for waging simultaneous operations in the three major sectors of the Soviet German front. Because of this, the enemy was compelled to halt his drive toward Moscow and assume defensive positions on that front in order to divert part of the forces of Army Group Centre to the support of Army Group South, facing our troops on the central and southwest fronts. Similarly, before the Germans were able to carry out their offensive at Leningrad, they were compelled to divert air power and armour from that city and regroup them west of Moscow for the support of Army Group Centre. In October and November 1941, the German forces were in a position to concentrate their offensive in only one sector, the Moscow sector, but even there, the growing Soviet resistance demonstrated that the enemy lacked sufficient forces to achieve the objectives of Operation Typhoon. The same gross strategic miscalculation was made in planning the summer campaign of 1942. At the basis of all these miscalculations were an obvious underestimation of the strength of our socialist land and its people under the guidance of the party of Lenin, and an overestimation of the Germans' own forces and capabilities. In planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler and his associates intended to throw all their available forces against us. This was the miscalculation of a reckless gambler. Despite the treason of the Pétain government, the working people of France did not bow their heads before the German occupation, nor did the freedom-loving peoples of Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. All of them kept up an armed struggle against the occupying forces. The enemy was thus confronted with a massive resistance movement. Britain also continued to fight, even though she did not use her capabilities to the fullest. Despite their initial successes up to the Battle of Moscow, the German forces were confronted with a number of unforeseen circumstances as soon as they invaded the Soviet Union. They never expected that they would have to fight both the Red Army at the front and a powerful guerrilla movement led by underground party units at the rear. Nor did the Germans anticipate the failure to achieve a single strategic objective, which compelled them to take up defensive positions along the entire Soviet front in 1941. They lost their strategic initiative, and their troops were exhausted and demoralized. The same thing happened at Stalingrad at the end of 1942. Enemy troops suffered tremendous losses in the first 16 months of fighting on the Soviet-German front. By November 1942, their losses exceeded 2 million dead, wounded, and missing in action. The best elements of the German forces were among the casualties, and the Nazi command had no replacements for them at the end of this first phase of the war. Nor did the enemy expect that the Soviet people, rallying around the party, would so swiftly affect the nation's changeover to a wartime economy and launch the mass production of tanks, planes, artillery, munitions, and everything else needed by the Red Army to achieve superiority over the German forces and ultimate victory. Despite the setbacks in the first phase of the war, the Red Army did not collapse under the German onslaught the way the Western armies had. On the contrary, the rugged conditions of war served to toughen and mature our troops so that, when they were supplied with the necessary arms, they were able to transform a defensive, retreating army into an offensive force. The organization and inspiration of our entire party yielded brilliant results both in the field and at home. The Soviet people quickly mobilized to provide the materials and supplies for the Red Army's struggle against the German forces. And so the first period of the Great Patriotic War ended with the imminent collapse of all the strategic plans of the Nazi command, and with substantial depletion of the forces and capabilities at Germany's disposal. This basic result of the struggle thus far predetermined to a large extent the subsequent course of the entire Second World War. These operational miscalculations by the Germans were further aggravated by poor intelligence. They were unable to detect preparations for our Stalingrad counter-offensive, which involved 11 armies, several separate mechanized cavalry and tank corps, brigades and other units, 13,500 guns and mortars, 1,100 anti-aircraft guns, 115 detachments of rocket artillery, 900 tanks, and 1,115 planes. By the start of our counter-offensive, the enemy's operational strategic dispositions in the south of the Soviet Union were as follows. The main forces of Army Group B operated in the area of the Middle Don at Stalingrad and farther south along the Sarpa Lakes. This included the Italian 8th Army, the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, and the German 6th and 4th Tank Armies. The average sector per division was 10 to 15 miles. This army group contained more than 1 million men, 675 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 10,000 guns and mortars. Numerically, the two sides were almost equal, except for a slight Soviet superiority in tanks. Army Group B was supported by the 4th Air Fleet and the 8th Air Corps. In working out its plan for a counter-offensive, the Soviet Supreme Command assumed that a defeat inflicted on the enemy at Stalingrad would also seriously endanger enemy forces in the Northern Caucasus and compel them to pull back in a hurry or face entrapment. Since Stalin's death, there has been some confusion about the real author of the counter-offensive plan, whose scale and results would be so far-reaching. Even though the question of authorship is not as important under socialism, and I have already described the various steps in the formulation of the plan, I would like to make some additional comments. It has been assumed that the first outlines were worked out at Supreme Headquarters as early as August 1942, and that the first version called for a rather limited counter-offensive. Actually, that was not the plan for the Great Counter-Offensive, but one for a counterattack intended to stop the enemy on the approaches to Stalingrad. At that time, no one at Supreme Headquarters even dreamed of a major counter-offensive, since we lacked both the manpower and the materiel for such a massive operation. It has also been said that the Military Council of the Stalingrad Front, the former Southeast Front, on its own initiative recommended the organization and execution of a counter-offensive to Supreme Headquarters on October 6th. To this, Vasilevsky has given the following reply. At dawn on October 6th, N.N. Voronov, V.D. Ivanov and I visited the observation post of the 51st Army near Lake Tazatsa. There we heard a report by the Army Commander N.I. Trufanov. That same evening, at a meeting with the Front Commander, Yeremenko, and his military council, Khrushchev, at Front Headquarters, we again discussed Supreme Headquarters' counter-offensive plan. Since the Front Command had no basic objections to the plan, we drafted a report accordingly to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief during the night. The following day, I asked the commander of the Don Front to prepare a similar report on his own front for Supreme Headquarters. I do not think there is anything to add to this. Vasilevsky convincingly shows that it was Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff that played the main role in the planning of the counter-offensive. Some of the historical accounts say that General Vatutin, the commander of the Southwest Front, later offered a plan for a counter-offensive. This raises the following questions. How much later? What plan? And was it a plan for his own front, or a general plan for a counter-offensive? We know that the Southwest Front was not formed until the end of October, when manpower and materiel for the new front were already being massed according to the plan for the general counter-offensive, which Supreme Headquarters had already approved. Perhaps we need only point out that, according to existing practice and regulations, every front commander was expected to work out an operations plan for his front and to submit it either to Supreme Headquarters or to its representative on the scene for approval. In that process, the front commander could, of course, express his views about coordination with neighbouring fronts and make other recommendations. The magnitude of the Stalingrad counter-offensive required a plan based not only on operational considerations, but also on concrete calculations of supplies and materiel. Who was able to make the necessary calculations for an operation on such a scale? Naturally, only the agencies that controlled the manpower and materiel, and that could only be Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff. It must be remembered that the General Staff was the creative and working apparatus of the Supreme Command throughout the war, and that not a single strategic operation could be carried out unless the General Staff had initiated and organized it. Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff thoroughly analyzed, as a matter of course, all the intelligence about the enemy received from individual fronts and armies in order to determine enemy intentions and the character of his military operations. They also considered suggestions advanced by the various staffs, front commanders, and services before arriving at a particular decision. Consequently, a plan for any strategic operation of magnitude could evolve only as a result of the combined effort of all services, staffs, and commanders. But the final and decisive responsibility for the planning and organization of such a major strategic operation belongs without question to Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff. It is equally evident that the actual defeat of the enemy was the work of those who risked their lives smashing the enemy with their bold thrusts, accurate fire, courage, and military skill. I am referring to our glorious soldiers, sergeants, and generals who, after the test of the first phase of the war, were now ready to take the initiative and inflict a catastrophic defeat on the Germans. Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff should be credited for having analysed all the factors of this great operation with scientific precision and for having anticipated the progress and conclusion of the battle. But the total plan for the counter-offensive cannot be attributed to any particular person. The main role in the first phase of the counter-offensive was to be played by the Southwest Front under General Vatutin. This front was to strike powerful, deep-ranging blows out of its bridgeheads on the south bank of the Don near Serafimovich and Kletskaya. The Stalingrad front was to attack from the area of the Sarpa Lakes south of Stalingrad. Shock forces of the two fronts were to meet near Kalach and Savetsky, trapping the main forces of the enemy at Stalingrad. The Southwest Front, with a main striking force consisting of the 21st Field Army, the 5th Tank Army, and elements of the 1st Guards Army, was to break out of its bridgeheads, smash through the defences of the Romanian Third Army, and drive with its mobile units toward the southeast to reach the Don between Bolsha-Nabatovsky and Kalach. This would place the troops of the Southwest Front in the rear of the enemy forces at Stalingrad, cutting off their communications with the west. This advance was to be protected on the southwest and west by an outer front formed by the 1st Guards Army under General Lelyushenko, and later by the 5th Tank Army under Lieutenant General P.L. Romanenko. These forces, driving toward the west, southwest, and south by the third day of the operation, were supposed to reach a line running through Veshenskaya, Bokovskaya, and along the Chir River to Oblivskaya. The ground forces of the Southwest Front were to be supported by the 2nd and 17th Air Armies, commanded by Major Generals K.N. Smirnov and S.A. Krasovsky. The Don Front was expected to launch 2 auxiliary attacks. One, coordinated with the Southwest Front, involved a thrust by the 65th Army from the bridgehead east of Kletskaya, with the objective of rolling back enemy defences along the south bank of the Don River. The other called for a thrust by the 24th Army from the area of Kashelinskaya southward along the east bank of the Don in the general direction of Vertiachi, with the objective of cutting off enemy forces in the small Don Bend from the troops at Stalingrad. The 66th Army north of Stalingrad was to engage the enemy to prevent him from manoeuvring his reserves. The ground operations of the Don front were to be supported by the 16th Air Army under General Rudenko. The Stalingrad front was expected to launch an offensive with its main forces, consisting of the 51st, 57th and 64th Armies, on a sector running from Ivanovka, south of Stalingrad, to the northern end of Lake Barmantsak. Their objective was to break through enemy defences and drive northwestward for a link-up with forces of the Southwest Front near Kalach and Sovetski, thus completing the entrapment of the German forces at Stalingrad. The 51st Army under Major General N.I. Trufanov had the task of breaking through enemy defences from bridgeheads in the strips of land between lakes Sapa, Tsatsa and Barmantsak, and driving toward the southwest in the general direction of Abganerovo. The 57th Army of General F.I. Tolbukin and the 64th Army of General M.S. Shumilov were to attack from the area of Ivanovka to the west and northwest, with the aim of enveloping the enemy forces at Stalingrad on the south. Troops of the 62nd Army of General Zhukov were tasked with pushing through the outer defences of the enemy and reinforcing Soviet forces at Stalingrad. As we know, the Soviet counter-offensive at Stalingrad was not only a victory in the military sense, but also a turning point in the war. The local commanders worked out the details, but the General Staff handled the overall outline and concept. Secrecy was intense. No official order for the formation of the new Southwest Front, nor for the appointment of General N.F. Vatutin to head it, and General S.P. Ivanov as his Chief of Staff, was issued until October 25th. Vatutin and Ivanov worked out their plans on a single map. A large command meeting was held near Filonovo in late October, presided over by Zhukov. Attending were Colonel General A.A. Novikov, Chief of the Red Air Force, Colonel General N.N. Voronov, Chief of Artillery, and Lieutenant General Ya.N. Fedunenko, Chief of Tanks. It was apparent from Novikov's comments that he had no understanding of the scale of the counter-offensive being planned. Zhukov worked out even the tiniest details, supply questions and recognition signals to be used when the Southwest Front and Stalingrad Front troops met after encircling the Nazis. He refused to permit any written orders to be drafted, fearing a breakdown in secrecy. As troops were moved up for the counter-offensive, they were permitted to travel only at night and were dispersed into villages. No reference to the upcoming attack was allowed in either letters or telephone conversations. S.P. Ivanov, Novaya I Noveshaya Istoria, January 1969, pp. 2021. HES 18. Vasilevsky provides the following account of their report. After these meetings, Zhukov and I checked the work of the front commanders and agreed on the tenor of the report we would make to Supreme Headquarters on the state of preparedness of the troops of the Stalingrad fronts. The concrete details of the operation were based on the preparatory work of the fronts and transferred to the map for our report to Supreme Headquarters. In our oral report we said, 1. Data from the fronts, verified by the General Staff, indicate equal strength on both sides in the Stalingrad sectors. Because of the creation of powerful groupings from headquarters reserves and the temporary slackening of operations in the secondary areas of the fronts, we have achieved significant superiority over our opponent in the area of the chief thrusts of the front. This will undoubtedly contribute toward the success of the operation. 2. No significant shift of enemy reserves from distant points to the Stalingrad sectors has been noted. Nor has any essential regrouping of the enemy forces on the overall front been observed. The German groupings remain essentially unchanged. Their main forces, the 6th and 4th Tank Armies, are engaged in protracted battles around the city. The flanks of these groups, i.e. in the areas of our future strikes, are defended by Romanian units. On the whole, the relative balance of forces in the Stalingrad sectors is favourable for carrying out the tasks assigned by Supreme Headquarters. 3. In the course of the operation, special attention must be given to the constant strengthening of the fronts with air support, the rapid replacement of losses in troops, especially in tank and mechanized forces, and the accumulation of new headquarters reserves in the area to ensure the successful conclusion of the operation and ensuing developments. 4. The concentration of troops and materiel, as ordered by headquarters, along with all supplemental measures ordered by the State Defense Committee, especially the development of rail facilities in the front areas, have been carried out with only slight deviation from schedule, thanks to enormous efforts by the rail and river authorities. 5. The operational tasks of all front commands, down to company commands, are correctly understood and have been worked out in practical terms in the terrain. Cooperation of infantry and artillery, and tanks and aviation, has also been worked out down to the company level. Special attention has been given to the preparation of tank, mechanized and cavalry corps. 6. With the completion of the area plans of operation, no supplemental corrections in the operational orders given to the front commanders and armies and already approved by headquarters are needed. 7. From the plan, it is clear that the basic role in the opening stage of the operation will be carried out by the Southwest Front, which, in our opinion, and in the opinion of the front commander, has sufficient forces and materiel for the task. 8. The link-up of the tank and mechanized troops of the Southwest and Stalingrad fronts should occur on the east bank of the Don in the region of Sovetski and Kalach in the course of the 3rd or 4th day of the operation. 9. Measures to establish the outer ring of encirclement, as outlined in the plan, have been worked out with the front commanders and armies, and with the commanders of the appropriate military units under their leadership. 10. As a result of the enormous political work carried out among the troops, the morale of the forces is good and their fighting spirit is high. 11. Everything is set for the offensive by the troops of the Southwest, and Don fronts to begin on November 19th, and by the Stalingrad front on November 20th. 12. The commanders of the fronts and armies have been instructed to announce the order to their troops on the night before the offensive. 13. In conclusion, we wish to report that all commanders of the units that are to participate in this Soviet operation of unprecedented scale and significance share our confidence in its success. After discussing the plan and the date for its execution, it was finally approved by headquarters. The coordination of actions across all 3 fronts for the duration of the operation was placed in my hands. Vasilevsky in Stalingradskaya Epopeya, Moscow, 1968, pp. 87-98. On November 17th, Zhukov returned to Moscow, but it wasn't just about the offensive on the Kalinin and Western fronts. Vasilevsky was called back the same day by Stalin, an unusual move with the Stalingrad counter-offensive almost at 0 hour. An urgent meeting of the State Defense Committee was convened to consider a letter sent to Stalin by General V.T. Volsky. Volsky, whose 4th Mechanized Corps was to be part of the southern arm of the pincers around Stalingrad, warned Stalin as an honest communist that the operation was doomed due to a lack of manpower and materiel. Vasilevsky, and presumably Zhukov, had to defend their plans. After Vasilevsky spoke, Stalin telephoned Volsky from the Kremlin council room. Volsky eventually withdrew his objections and agreed to carry out his orders. To everyone's surprise, Stalin remained calm and did not lose his temper. Satisfied, he allowed Vasilevsky to fly back to Stalingrad, where he arrived the morning of November 19th, just too late for the jump-off of the troops. This curious episode's full implications are unclear, though it might have been an attempt to establish grounds for charges against Vasilevsky and/or Zhukov if the counter-offensive failed. Meanwhile, Zhukov, ostensibly focused on planning the Kalinin and Western Front's offensives, remained in close contact with Stalin and Stalingrad. Even after travelling to the Kalinin front, he continued to advise Stalin on the Stalingrad operation. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19th, troops of the Southwest Front launched a powerful assault on the defences of the Romanian Third Army in 2 sectors. General Romanenko's 5th Tank Army advanced from the bridgehead southwest of Serafimovich, and Major General I.M. Chistyakov's 21st Army advanced from the Kletskaya bridgehead. Enemy troops were unable to resist and either retreated in panic or surrendered. German forces behind the Romanians attempted a counterattack, but it was crushed by our 1st and 26th Tank Corps. A tactical breakthrough in the southwest front sector had been achieved. General Romanenko, a gallant officer and highly capable commander, was in his element. The enemy initially expected the main thrust to come from the 21st Army sector and through reserves, including the Romanian 1st Tank Division and the German 14th and 22nd Tank Divisions, against Chistyakov's forces. However, the German 22nd Tank Division and the Romanian 1st Tank Division were soon deployed against the 1st Tank Corps of the 5th Tank Army under Major General V.V. Zhukov. The 26th Tank Corps under Major General A.G. Rodin inflicted a heavy defeat on the Romanian 1st Tank Division and captured the headquarters of the Romanian 5th Army Corps. Many Romanians fled in panic, while others surrendered. Once our forces broke into operational terrain, the main force of the Romanian Third Army, along with the German reserves, was completely destroyed. The 26th Tank Corps and the 4th Tank Corps pressed their advance toward Kalach for the planned link-up with the 4th Mechanized Corps of the Stalingrad front. During the night of November 22, 23, an advanced detachment of the 26th Tank Corps, led by Lieutenant Colonel G.N. Filipov, seized a bridge across the Don River, ensuring a rapid crossing for the entire Tank Corps and the capture of Kalach. Filipov was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for his feat, and his men were decorated. On November 24th, the 21st Field Army and the 5th Tank Army took over 30,000 prisoners in mopping up operations of the trapped enemy forces. Another reason for our failure to achieve a breakthrough was an inadequate supply of tanks, artillery, mortars, and air support. However, let us go back to our operations around Stalingrad. Those operations, designed to liquidate the trapped forces, proceeded very slowly during the first half of December. The enemy, hoping for the relief that Hitler had promised, fought stubbornly for every position. Our troops around the ring, weakened by the diversion of some units to counter the relief force from Kotelnikovo, made little progress. For the Germans, the defeat at Stalingrad threatened to grow into a catastrophe of great strategic magnitude. To save the situation, the Nazi command tried, first of all, to stabilize the front around Stalingrad so that Army Group A could be pulled out of the Caucasus. With this objective in mind, the Germans formed a new Army Group Don under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. In the view of the Nazi leadership, he was the most suitable man for the task and one of the ablest of the German commanders. The new Army Group was formed out of units shifted from other sectors of the Soviet-German front, as well as from France and Germany. As we have now learned, Manstein planned to form two shock forces to try to relieve the forces trapped at Stalingrad. One force was to be assembled at Kotelnikovo and the other at Tormosin, but fate did not smile upon either Manstein or the trapped forces. The Wehrmacht was suffering from an acute shortage of reserves, and whatever forces could be mobilized moved very slowly along the overextended communication lines. Moreover, our guerrillas were aware of the destination of the German troops that were being rushed southward, and they did their utmost to sabotage the enemy's movements. In spite of the Nazis' reprisals and their precautions, valiant patriots succeeded in derailing dozens of trains loaded with German troops. Time passed, and the massing of the German forces that were supposed to go to the relief of Stalingrad continued to be delayed. With a foreboding of impending catastrophe, Hitler ordered Manstein to start the operation without waiting for all his troops to arrive. Manstein launched the offensive on December 12th, driving along the railroad from Kotelnikovo. His striking force included the 6th and 23rd Tank Divisions, later joined by the 17th Tank Division, as well as a separate battalion of heavy Tiger tanks, 4 infantry divisions, several reinforcement units, and 2 Romanian cavalry divisions. Within 3 days, the enemy succeeded in advancing 25 miles towards Stalingrad and forcing the Aksai-Yesolovsky River. Fierce fighting broke out near Verkhne-Kumsky, and both sides suffered heavy losses. The enemy kept pressing forward regardless of cost. But the Soviet forces, hardened by previous battles, stood fast on their defense lines. Only after the Germans had thrown their 17th Tank Division into the battle and sharply stepped up aerial bombings did elements of the 51st Army and General Shapkin's Cavalry Corps retreat behind the Mishkova River. At that point, the enemy relief force was 25 miles from Stalingrad, and victory evidently seemed quite real to the Germans, but their hopes were premature. On orders from Supreme Headquarters, Vasilevsky reinforced the Soviet troops on December 19th with General Malinovsky's Second Guards Army. This army, well equipped with tanks and artillery, finally tipped the balance in favor of the Soviet side. Meanwhile, the Southwest Front, reinforced by the Sixth Army transferred from the Voronezh Front, had started its offensive on December 16th, with the objective of smashing the German forces on the Middle Don and driving into the rear of the enemy's Tormosin grouping. The attacking forces included the 1st Guards Army under General Kuznetsov, the 3rd Guards Army under General Lelyushenko. By that time, the 1st Guards had been divided into two armies, the 1st Guards and the 3rd Guards, and the 6th Army under Major General F.M. Kharitonov. These forces overcame the Italian 8th Army and developed a rapid advance in the direction of Morozovsk. The advance was led by the 24th and 25th Tank Corps and the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps. On the right, the 17th and 18th Tank Corps drove in the direction of Milarovo. Manstein intended to use his forces in the Tormosin area for a thrust towards Stalingrad, but the rapid advance of the Southwest Front compelled him to use them to counter the threat to the flank and rear of the entire Army Group Don. In a telegraphic report to Supreme Headquarters on December 28th, General Vatutin described the offensive as follows. Everything that faced our front, that is, about 17 divisions, has been completely crushed, and their stores have been seized by our forces. We have taken 60,000 prisoners, and about the same number of the enemy have been killed, so that, with a few rare exceptions, the pitiful remains of these forces are not putting up any resistance. The enemy continues to stand fast along the line from Oblivskaya to Verkhnechirski. In the area of Morozovsk, we took prisoners of the 11th Tank Division and the 8th Airborne Division, which previously faced Romanenko's army. Lelyushenko's army and the mobile forces of our front are encountering the stiffest resistance from enemy units that crossed the Don River from the area of Kotelnikovo and moved up to a line running through Chernishkovsky, Morozovsk, Skosyrskaya, and Tatsinskaya. These enemy forces are attempting to hold that line to halt the further advance of our mobile forces, and thus to enable other German forces to pull back. Or the enemy may, under favourable circumstances, try to hold on to that salient altogether for a later thrust aimed at relieving the encircled group at Stalingrad. But it won't work. We will do everything in our power to cut off that salient. Our aerial reconnaissance is reporting daily enemy troop arrivals in the areas of Rososh, Starobelsk, Voroshilovgrad, Chebatovka, Kamensk, Likhaya, and Zverevo. It is hard to judge the enemy's intentions, but he seems to be preparing the northern Donets as the main line of defence. The enemy will first have to close the 200-mile-wide gap torn in his defences by our forces. It would be good if we could maintain continuous pressure, but that would require reinforcements. Our present forces are all busy completing Operation Little Saturn, and additional forces would be required for Great Saturn. Stalin and I replied, "Your first task is to get Badanov out of trouble and to rush Pavlov and Rusyanov to his assistance. You were right in allowing Badanov to give up Tatsinskaya in an emergency. It would be well if your thrust against Tormosin with the 8th Cavalry Corps were supported by an additional infantry unit. As for the 3rd Cavalry Corps and one rifle division that have been sent through Suvorovsky toward Tormosin, that was very timely. We have already given you the 2nd and 23rd Tank Corps to convert Little Saturn into Great Saturn. In a week you will be getting 2 more tank corps and 3 or 4 rifle divisions. We have some doubts about the 18th Tank Corps, which you want to send to Skosyrskaya. You'd better leave it and the 17th Tank Corps around Milarovo and Verkhneh-Tarasovsky. You should bear in mind that over long distances, tank corps are best launched in pairs, rather than alone. Otherwise they risk falling into a situation like Badanov's. Where is the 18th Tank Corps now? Vatutin was asked. "The 18th Tank Corps is just east of Milarovo. The 18th won't be cut off. Just remember Badanov, don't forget Badanov, get him out at any cost." "I will do everything possible to get Badanov out," Vatutin assured us. The 24th Tank Corps under General V.M. Badanov distinguished itself particularly during the offensive of the Southwest Front. It advanced 125 miles in 5 days and seized Tatsinskaya, cutting the Likhaya-Stalingrad Railroad. Badanov's corps was then cut off by superior enemy forces that had been shifted from Kotelnikovo and Tormosin. But his men kept their heads. They put up a stubborn defence, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy, and under their commander's skillful leadership, they ultimately broke out of the trap. In view of its great contribution to the defeat of the enemy in the Volga-Don area, the 24th Corps was converted into the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, and its commander was the first in the country to be awarded the Order of Suvorov Second Class. Many of his soldiers, commanders, and political commissars also received decorations. The successful strikes of the Southwest and Stalingrad fronts against the enemy forces in the areas of Kotelnikovo and Morozovsk finally sealed the fate of Paulus's forces encircled at Stalingrad. Our troops, in a brilliant execution of their assignment, broke up Manstein's attempt to reach the trapped Germans. By the beginning of January, Vatutin's forces had reached a line running through Novaya Kalitva, Kriskoye, Chertkovo, Voloshino, Milarovo, and Morozovsk, thus posing a direct threat to all the German forces in the Caucasus. By the end of December, the German troops around Kotelnikovo pulled back to a line running through Tsimlianskaya, Zhukovskaya, Dubovskoye, and Zimovniki. The enemy's Tormosin group pulled back to a line through Chernishkovsky, Loznoy, and Tsimlianskaya. Manstein's attempt to break through our outer front and free the encircled forces at Stalingrad had thus failed. This was now clear to both the command and the soldiers of the trapped units. Despair and a desire to save themselves from inevitable catastrophe were widespread. Now that their hopes for relief had been frustrated, deep disappointment set in. After the collapse of the breakout attempt, the Nazi military and political leadership ceased further efforts to save the trapped forces, and instead ordered them to hold out as long as possible so as to tie down Soviet forces. The Germans needed as much time as they could get to pull their forces out of the Caucasus and to shift troops from other areas in order to create a new front capable of halting our counter-offensive. Supreme Headquarters, in turn, took measures to liquidate the encircled German troops as rapidly as possible and thus make additional Soviet forces available to move against the retreating enemy in the Caucasus and elsewhere in the south. Stalin constantly prodded the front commanders. At the end of December, in a meeting of the State Defense Committee, he proposed that operations to liquidate the trapped Germans be headed by a single commander. The two front commanders were beginning to get in each other's way. The other members of the Defense Committee agreed. "Whom should we entrust with the final liquidation of the enemy?" Stalin asked. Someone suggested Rokossovsky. "Why aren't you saying anything?" Stalin asked me. "In my opinion, either commander is capable of doing the job," I replied. Yeremenko's feelings would be hurt, of course, if you transferred his Stalingrad front to Rokossovsky. "This is not the time to worry about hurt feelings," Stalin interjected. "Telephone Yeremenko and tell him about the decision of the State Defense Committee." That same evening I called Yeremenko on the high-security line and said, "Andrei Ivanovich, the State Defense Committee has decided to charge Rokossovsky with the final liquidation of the enemy's Stalingrad group, and you are to transfer the 57th, 64th, and 62nd Armies from the Stalingrad front to the Don front." "What brought this on?" Yeremenko asked. I explained the considerations that had led to the decision. The headquarters of the Stalingrad front was supposed to continue to head the forces operating in the direction of Kotelnikovo. Shortly thereafter, the Stalingrad front was renamed the Southern Front and went into operations against German forces in the Rostov area. By a Supreme Headquarters directive dated December 30th, the three armies of the Stalingrad front were transferred to the Don front. As of January 1st, the Don front thus had a total of 212,000 men, 6,500 guns and mortars, 250 tanks, and 300 planes. At the end of December, Vasilevsky was mainly concerned with operations against German forces at Kotelnikovo, Tormosin, and Morozovsk. General Voronov was appointed representative of Supreme Headquarters at the Don Front, and with the Front Military Council, he drew up a plan for the final liquidation of the trapped enemy forces. After the plan had been submitted to Supreme Headquarters and the General Staff, the following directive was sent to General Voronov. In the view of Supreme Headquarters, your main task in the first phase of the operation should be the cutting off and destruction of the western enemy grouping around Kravtsov, Baburkino, Marinovka, and Karpovka. This should be achieved by directing the main thrust of our forces southward from the area of Dmitrievka, State Farm No. 1, and Baburkino toward Karpovka Station, and an auxiliary thrust by the 57th Army out of the area of Kravtsov and Sklarov for a link-up of the two thrusts around Karpovka Station. The defence of Stalingrad and its strategic impact. The defence of Stalingrad, the preparation of the counter-offensive, and my contribution to the other operations in the south meant a great deal to me. They represented much broader experience in organising a counter-offensive than I had gained in 1941 during the Battle of Moscow, where the forces at our disposal were inadequate to trap the enemy. For the general supervision of the counter-offensive at Stalingrad and its results, I was among those awarded the Order of Suvorov First Class. This award was not only a great honour for me, but also symbolised the country's expectation that I would continue to work towards bringing complete victory closer. Vasilevsky received the second of these orders, and others who were awarded the Order of Suvorov First Class included Voronov, Vatutin, Yeremenko, and Rokossovsky. A large number of generals, officers, sergeants, and soldiers also received high decorations. The defeat of the German forces at Stalingrad, along the Don, and in the Caucasus created conditions favourable for expanding our offensive on all fronts in the southwest. Operations in the Don-Volga area were followed by the successful Ostrogojsk-Rossosh and Voronezh-Kostonoye operations. Soviet forces, pressing toward the west with their winter offensive, captured key cities such as Rostov, Novocherkassk, Kursk, and Kharkov. This success led to a deterioration of the overall operational and strategic situation for Nazi troops along the entire Soviet-German front. An unusual problem arose when Soviet forces attempted to mop up the Paulus Group. They met far more resistance than expected, and General Vasilevsky's calculations were thrown out of balance. It was later discovered that Soviet intelligence had initially estimated the trapped enemy forces at 85,000 to 90,000, but the actual number was closer to 300,000. Vasilevsky, Wojenno-Historyczny Journal, January 1966, pp. 15-16. The issue of coping with Manstein's attempt to rescue Paulus was more complicated than it initially appeared. Vasilevsky, while at the headquarters of the 51st Army, realized the danger of Manstein's offensive on December 12th. Unable to reach Stalin, he immediately contacted Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky and planned to divert the crack Second Guards Army of General Rodion Malinovsky from the Don front to the Stalingrad front. Despite Rokossovsky's objections, Vasilevsky pressed forward. It wasn't until the evening of December 12th that Stalin was reached, and after much resistance gave the green light for the army's transfer. On the morning of December 13th, Stalin finally agreed to move Malinovsky's forces, and by December 19th they had halted Manstein's advance. Vasilevsky and Rokossovsky in Stalingradskaya Epopeia, Moscow, 1968, pp. 103, 107, 172, 173. The Soviets also benefited from Hitler's refusal to let Paulus break out or retreat, which prevented him from making contact with Manstein and allowed Soviet forces to finish the encirclement. Troops of the 64th, 57th and 21st Armies proceeded to liquidate the southern Nazi group, delivering blows from the southwest and northwest, forcing the enemy to lay down his arms on January 31st. Field Marshal Paulus was taken prisoner, and he was brought to us at staff headquarters. Marshal N. Voronov and I were in the building when Paulus was brought in. He was a tall, thin, well-knit man, obviously tense. He had a tic in his face and his hands shook. He seemed to expect something dreadful to happen. After offering him a seat and a cigarette, we observed him nervously sipping tea while attempting to control his emotions. Rokossovsky in Stalingradskaya Epopeya, Moscow, 1968, p. 186. On February 4, 1943, Rokossovsky and Voronov were called back to Moscow. When they arrived at the airport, they were surprised to see generals and officers greeting them with gold epaulets, something they hadn't been told had been introduced into the Red Army. The two officers were then taken to Stalin's office, where they were warmly congratulated for their success in eliminating the Nazi groupings at Stalingrad. Rokossovsky in Stalingradskaya Epopeya, Moscow, 1968, pp. 189-190. After Stalingrad, everything was different. The Russians knew they were going to win the war, while the Germans, except for Hitler, began to suspect they might lose. For Zhukov, this was a turning point in his relationship with Stalin. By 1943, Stalin had developed a more confident style of war leadership and was increasingly relying on his military commanders, particularly those emerging from the war itself, such as Vasilevsky. Despite the victory at Stalingrad, the Germans were still a formidable enemy, holding key territories including Ukraine, Crimea, and the Donets industrial basin. However, the outcome of the war was beginning to lean in favor of the Allies. The question in spring 1943 was, where would the next major battle take place? Zhukov believed the next major clash would happen in the area of Kursk and Voronezh, given the German loss of strength in southern Russia. He was correct, as the Germans were indeed planning an offensive in the region. Zhukov's strategy was to let the Germans strike first, then counterattack once their forces were spent. Stalin was initially hesitant, fearing the Germans' striking power, but Zhukov's approach ultimately won out. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, with more than 6,000 tanks involved. The Germans suffered devastating losses and were never again able to seize the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The battle not only marked a turning point in the war, but also showed the superiority of Soviet tanks over the German Tiger tanks. Stalin was quick to acknowledge the significance of the victory, revising the order of the day to emphasize that the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. A new tradition was introduced. Instead of ringing church bells, artillery salutes were fired in honor of the victory. Some Soviet military historians have called Kursk the Nazi Waterloo, a term that seems fitting. The battle's outcome irreversibly turned the tide of the war in favor of the Soviet Union, and the German army was forced into a defensive posture for the rest of the war. By the spring of 1943, the situation had dramatically shifted. After suffering significant defeats, the German, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces had retreated to a new defensive line. However, this quiet period would soon end as the Germans launched counter-offensives in key areas, including the Voronezh and southwest fronts. During this time, Soviet forces were still dealing with the challenges of regrouping, but under the leadership of Zhukov and his counterparts, they were preparing for future offensives, particularly in the Kursk salient. The battle plans were refined, and when the time came, the Soviet response was decisive.